This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And we ended last week with some, I would say, creative interpretations of the law of America. And I'm sure that this week will be completely normal legal proceedings with absolutely no weird shit about misapplied Atlantic treaties at all.
Oh, this is going to get even fucking weirder. I'm going to be real with you. So we are back with part 2 of the Sovereign Citizens Movement. We left off part 1, which was more of the kind of history and the origins of some of the ideas that form the backbone of the Sov-Cit movement, as you might call it. And by the way, I do want to note, just in case you ever run into any of these fucking weirdos in your life, they usually will not call themselves sovereign citizens. They prefer terms like state citizen or freeman or constitutionalist. Whichever one they choose tends to vary based on which crazy conspiracy theories they have selected for themselves. But collectively, academically, they are called sovereign citizens to kind of group them together. And this week, we're going to see what happens when we move out of the 90s and into the 2000s, and we take this weird mishmash of ideas and stick it into Web 1.0.
All right. So the 90s are a big time for these sovereign citizen movements, I would say, not representing themselves well on the public stage. Some very unfortunate shootouts with the law and standoffs, and a couple of very notable incidents involving federal law enforcement. So how does this movement, which is really not in such a great place in the public eye, find a receptive audience online?
So in a certain sense, that's honestly pretty hard to track, actually. The U.S. government obviously has a good amount of material dealing with individual sovereign citizen movements that have kind of run afoul of the feds in some way or another. But that means it's really limited to those specific criminal cases, not to the movement as a whole. And what's out there also, not a lot of it has been collated into public-facing reports. From what I have found, there has not been much of an effort to address the sovereign citizen movement as a collective, as opposed to individual groups that have been deemed to be dangerous. It's also hard to track, honestly. Two groups that do a lot of great work on that subject, the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, and the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Centers, they put a lot of resources into tracking Sov-Cit movements, among others. But they have limited resources, and both of them deal really with extremism and hate more generally, not specifically with the sovereign citizen movement. Meanwhile, media coverage tends to focus on just the most wackadoodle parts of the movement, and it gets pretty fucking weird. I'm gonna be real with you guys. We're gonna get to some of that, but that's not necessarily helpful in terms of the kind of origin side of it. There's also the tragic reality that it didn't occur to me. So much of Web 1.0 has been lost to the dustbin of history. The link rot has set in. The servers have been shut down. The Internet Archive is woefully incomplete. And so actually tracking how a lot of these ideas first started showing up on like old school like BBS, like Web 1.0 bulletins or forums or, IRC chat rooms, and then kind of metastatized into other movements is actually pretty hard to do.
Yeah, this is the very early days of the internet that was functionally unsearchable in the way that we consider the modern internet searchable, and a lot of these were just hosted on like some random guy's server in his basement somewhere. So when that server goes down, that information is lost.
So what we can tell happens is that by the late 90s to early 2000s, the sovereign citizen kind of movement, we can start calling it that at this point, I think, is starting to become its own thing relative to its roots in the posse comitatus or militia movements. We're going to look at some specific movements later on, and we'll see a lot of them get started in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. That's really when that split is starting to happen. The connection never really totally goes away. You'll still hear some sovereign citizen-ish stuff from militia groups today, or from neo-Nazis, and of course all three of those groups tend to share the core belief of anything the government does that I don't like is illegal. So in that sense, they're all very much trees in the same forest, to return to a metaphor from last time. But it's really in the late 2000s, from what we can tell, that the sovereign citizen movement starts to gather momentum independently. Brian Slater, who did his master's thesis on this subject, did a statistical analysis of law cases filed with like federal courts per year that rely on sovereign citizen jargon. And he found that in 2006, there were 11 case filings that he could find that fit that profile. By 2015, that goes to 142.
So when you say law cases are being filed, what kinds of law cases are you talking about here? Because if we're moving out of the era of the sovereign citizens being very associated with the militia movements, who I would assume are when they are involved in legal battles, it's probably about things like questionable gun ownership. What is this new wave of legal cases involving people who are making these bizarre legal claims about?
We're going to get into some examples in a little bit, but not to stereotype, I would say it's mostly driving without a license and alimony or child support payments.
Oh boy, a lot of divorced dads, huh?
This whole movement, I do think, has big divorced dad energy in the like worst and most pejorative way you could use that term. Um, so it's really hard, I think, to talk generally about the sovereign citizen movement because of that, because it's not really a movement. It's a bunch of different kind of discrete groups that use this weird language. That even makes like saying numbers for how many of these people there are, it's a little hard to say. The estimated peak in 2015 is around 300,000 sovereign citizens in the US and even more internationally, but that's just an estimate. But it is pretty clear that the sovereign citizen movement is much bigger than the like posse comitatus movement ever was. That peaked. Our estimates are somewhere between 12 and 50,000 people in the 70s. So by comparison, even with the high end of the comitatus movement, you have about 6 times that number in sovereign citizens. The way I think it makes sense to approach this, given the complexities of talking generally about the sovereign citizens, I want to return to what we did last time and kind of go over the definition of what are the common beliefs associated with this movement. And then I've pulled out a couple of illustrative examples. I may have stacked the deck to pick the weirdest sovereign citizen movements that I possibly could. But I like to think this is still a reasonably representative set. So I think that's the way to do it. So I'm going to start with a definition from Christine Sarteschi, who wrote a book called Sovereign Citizens, A Psychological and Criminological Analysis, which I made pretty substantial use of for this episode in particular. She calls them, quote, a subculture of individuals who believe the American government is illegitimate and holds no authority over anyone who recognizes themselves as being sovereign. They vehemently reject being citizens of the U.S. Their logic is that since the U.S. government is illegitimate, law enforcement officers, the judicial system, and all other government representatives have no authority over them. Sovereign citizens have no respect for the existing laws of America. They consider themselves to be above the law. They have reinterpreted the Constitution such that existing law, the currently accepted law, is rejected and replaced in their minds by only laws favorable to themselves. They accomplish this by utilizing a mix of pseudo-legal and conspiracy-laden arguments. So, what are those pseudo-legal and conspiracy-laden arguments? We talked about a few of them last time, the distinction between sovereign, real citizens, and federal or U.S. citizens that a lot of sovereign citizens believe was created by the 14th Amendment, with the general belief that you can refuse to claim this federal status and retain the rights of your sovereign citizen status, which is grounded in an interpretation of common law that limits the ability of government to basically like control you at all, which is why a lot of sovereign citizens, for example, tend to not get driver's licenses or reject their social security or anything like that, because it represents a way of accepting the contract of lesser citizenship. That ties into the whole idea of believing the U.S. government went bankrupt at some point and was reorganized as a corporation. When exactly is a matter of hot dispute, but it usually has something to do with the gold standard and the belief that the current fiat currency must be valueless, because who could believe that money only has value as a social construct? And therefore, the government must be taking out loans against every new citizen to service its foreign debts, which are, of course, owed to a mysterious cabal of bankers. We all know who that refers to. It's always the Jews. They always come back to this. And importantly for sovereign citizens, they believe that because the American government is a corporation, all laws are actually contracts, and like a business contract, both parties have to opt in. And if you opt out, you can just opt out of the speed limit or having to pay taxes. That's just a thing you can do in the same way you could choose not to buy your apples from Walmart or something.
So I have a question about laws being opted out of here.
I'll do my best.
So I have noticed that this is a pretty common problem among movements like, for instance, the libertarians, even the ones who are genuinely doing it more as a philosophical exercise, but following the actual laws tend to struggle with. Movements like this tend to attract a certain kind of person who would like to opt out of a certain kind of law about the age at which you should have sex with people. Is this a problem for this movement?
So I didn't find, I found one example of a group that definitely went in that direction. I don't know that I can say for sure that every group has that issue. But you definitely open yourself to a certain kind of personality who has a very strong reason to want to believe the law shouldn't apply to them. And from what I can tell, that usually the most innocent reason that that's the case is they don't want to pay taxes. That's the best option. The other ones are, it can get worse. One that we didn't get into actually, by the way, last time, and this is an addition, a little extra sousson added to the sovereign citizen stew in the early 2000s, strawman theory. Have you heard of strawman theory?
That's the guy that people always are arguing about on the internet, right?
You and I think, are on very different parts of the internet. So if you have not heard of strawman theory, this is the notion that you are actually two different people. Did you know that you are actually two different people?
We contain dualities, man.
Specifically, the duality you contain is your physical flesh and blood self, and your straw man, which is a corporate identity that exists in your name. And that distinction is marked by the fact that in government documents, if you look at your birth certificate, for example, your name is written in all caps. And believers of strawman theory believe that that is your corporate identifier. That is the shell corporation that exists, Demetrius Spinrad Incorporated, in all caps. They
believe in this whole elaborate theory because they think their driver's license is shouting at them?
Yeah.
That's not how capitalization works.
I do also want to point out that you can just look up a list of legally registered corporations. That's why you legally register them. You will notice that every person living in America is not a legally registered corporation.
My taxes would be so much better if I were a legally registered corporation. Honestly, the tax rate is lower.
This is one of those things that tends to, this is the part of the sovereign citizen movement that I think tends to appeal to people who want an infinite money cheat code. Because the theory is that in some way you can liberate your straw man to gain access to the secret government bank account associated with your incorporated strawman personality, and thus get the earnings from that.
We talked a bit in our last episode about this being a fairly classic con of people claiming that there is some secret amount of money held by the government that only they can have access to if you pay them to learn how to get access to it. Is that something that people are pulling here?
Well, here's the thing. The guy who created this, I don't know how much money he made off of it. He was just a hateful lunatic. His name is Roger Elvick, and he is an old friend of our subject from last time, William Potter Gale, so he is a posse comitatus guy, and a former member of the Aryan Nations before he got busted for fraud in 2003. And he's the one who first starts spreading this whole strawman theory. when he is very explicitly anti-Semitic about it, believing that your corporate strawman is owned by the Jewish banking cabal unless you liberate it. And then that idea is one of the ones that then starts to catch on in other like sovereign citizen movements. It spreads outside of its neo-Nazi roots, though there's always kind of that euphemistic, that dog whistle language of the banking cabal that owns your straw man. That never really, that part becomes implied rather than directly stated as it used to be. But spreads beyond kind of just the Nazis and into a whole range of different groups.
Yeah, that is one of the quite frightening things about the current age of conspiracy theories is a ton of them have very messed up anti-Semitic roots, and a ton of the people perpetuating it now don't know how to look for those dog whistles. They're just passing them along.
Maybe in the show notes, I would love if we can stick one of my favorite essays by a PNW local, Eric Ward, who talks a lot about the role that combating anti-Semitism has to play in fighting like white nationalist movements more generally. That you really can't do that without fighting against anti-Semitism as an idea. The essay is called Skin in the Game. It makes the case very effectively in a way I don't really think I can just sort of off the cuff. But consider, returning to the plea at the end of the last episode, consider this your reminder that if you find those kind of people icky, well, you're going to have to work with you're going to have to work with the Jews, because we can't get them to stop doing this on their own, or on our own.
As much as I love living in the Pacific Northwest, it definitely has a combination of a lot of very well entrenched white nationalist movements and a population that is not very attuned to being able to tell when someone is dog whistling. So
Yeah.
there's a lot that slips under the radar that probably shouldn't.
Yeah. Let's turn to a somewhat different subject. I would like to point out some key ideas of sovereign citizen behavior, both to kind of point to how all of these weird roots of conspiracies tend to kind of form together, and also to give you all a primer. How can you spot these people when they're out in the wild? What are some things you can look for when your weird uncle shows up to a family gathering to be like, oh no, he's gone to the bad part of the internet?
So tell me what our theoretical uncle, our collective weird uncle, has been getting up to on Twitter these days.
Well, one of the real markers of this, and I got all of these from the Sarteshi book, which I think is excellent on this subject, is the use of weird signatures in any sort of mail or legal document. The Anti-Defamation League also has a great briefing on this. So, for example, a lot of them will put the phrase sui juris after their names, which is a Latin phrase meaning competent to handle your own affairs. Another one, and my Latin is not very good, sui potestate esse, which means having full power over your dominion. These words, or also sometimes citations from the Uniform Commercial Code, they believe they are ways to like sign something without it having being a legally binding contract. So like, you can write a letter to the US government being like, no, I don't have to pay my taxes, and then sign that after your name, and it's like a magic spell that means the government can't be like, well, you sent us a piece of mail, so you are bound by this contract.
So they think that the US government secretly became a corporation controlled by the globalists, but they left this one little back door in there.
Yes.
There's one way out of this, and you too can use this one little hack to not have to pay taxes.
I don't know, like, psychologically how you would really explain this, but there is definitely something to the idea that a lot of these people genuinely believe the law is wizard magic, and that just like in Baldur's Gate, if you shout something that sounds like it's Latin, like, that will just alter the fabric of reality. Like, you'll cast an upscaled counterspell to the government, like, taxing you, and be like, no.
Well, it is a genuine problem that our legal code, because it has to be written in very specific and very concise language that means a very specific thing, it is actually quite hard for someone without a legal background to interpret. And even I, who have been doing this show for a while, cannot always interpret the text of the law. without going and finding a lawyer explaining that. Um, so yeah, the law often does feel like wizard magic when you live under our system. There is a lot of lack of clarity.
I think that, yeah, there's definitely something to be said for the law being written in a way that's not accessible. These guys are going to take it to a much bigger level. But I don't want to skip ahead here. There's a few good things here. Another great sovereign citizen tactic here: copywriting your own name, putting a copyright symbol after it, because then the government is a corporation. Governments can't, or that means corporations can't use copyrights without consent, so they can't write anything to you, or they're violating your copyright.
Wait, okay. Are they actually applying for the copyright for their own name,
I
for
have
which they would
no
almost
idea.
surely been rejected, or would they just put the C in a circle symbol after
I
their
believe it is the
name?
second one, because applying for a copyright implies recognizing the legitimate authority of the federal government to oversee commerce. Despite the fact that that's actually written into the American Constitution, the
But
Commerce Clause.
copyright only exists because of the American legal code.
Yeah.
Copyright is not a like universal free floating fact of the universe.
No, bro,
It
it's common
exists
law. Don't
because
worry
our
about
legal
it.
it exists because our legal system made it exist. That's the only reason why it exists.
No, I'm sure there's some like obscure medieval case you can point to be like, copyright's just always been a thing. Also, it's wizard magic. Don't worry about it. Another classic, signing your letters as your name, trustee for your name in all caps. In other words, distinguishing that you are writing on behalf of your flesh and blood self, not your straw man, right? The government can't control you with your straw man. Claiming that police and courts don't have jurisdiction over you, because the government is a corporation and they don't consent to the government's control, and therefore they've opted out of the law. You can watch a bunch of YouTube videos of sovereign citizens fighting like traffic tickets where they just shout the phrase, "I do not consent," over and over again. That is why they're doing that, because they believe that it is an opt-in system. Another insane one that I absolutely love. So I haven't spent that much time in courtrooms, shockingly enough. But a lot of them, is my understanding, do have an American flag decorated with gold fringe, which was initially a military thing. Now it's just a fun piece of decor you can add to your flags. But a lot of sovereign citizens believe that it's a military flag because American courts all practice admiralty law and they're not in the Navy, so that doesn't apply to them. Which seems to come from the whole gold standard, money is not real and everything's commercial law, but you might also recognize it as just a bit from Arrested Development. You're a crook,
I
Captain
truly
Hook.
don't understand why in this secret conspiracy where they secretly turned America into a corporation did they then also decide that all courts are now naval courts now? When did we take to the sea legally?
We've always been at the sea because of commercial law or some shit like that. I don't fucking know. A lot of them tend to prefer self-made licenses or license plates, or claiming they just don't need them. One of my favorites is the Constitution only gives the power to regulate commerce to the government, and so if they are just traveling rather than like hauling freight, claiming they don't need a license because they are not driving, that would imply that they are engaged in some kind of like commercial haul trucking, which would require a license. They're just traveling, which the government doesn't have the ability to regulate. I want to point out that's not how the Ninth Amendment works. It is a power explicitly devolved to the states to regulate transit under their jurisdiction. It's like the Constitution is not an easy read, but it's not that hard, guys. Come on.
I'm going to say some words that you did not expect to ever come out of my mouth, but I think I was a little too hard on the libertarians.
Oh, I did it. I got Dimitri to sympathize with the libertarians.
Most libertarians, not all, some of them are kind of fun to hang out with, but most libertarians want to have absolutely insufferable philosophical debates. But they stop there at the philosophy. They acknowledge that the law exists. They do not live in fantasy land where we are secretly controlled by corporation naval courts.
Uh, I'm not even done yet, man. I've still got two things
Oh
left on this
God.
common belief
Oh
system.
no. Okay, okay.
All
And this
right.
is only the common belief system. This isn't even fringe
Well,
by
one of
sovereign
them is
citizen
common. The other
standards.
is like medium tier fringe, I would say. Uh,
Okay.
Sovereign citizens love to quote from Black's Law Dictionary, and generally quoting from dictionaries, from legal dictionaries, as though they are authoritative. And especially for some reason, I mean, probably because, later editions were rewritten by the Jews or something, they love to quote older versions of Black's Law Dictionary. That's not how that works. Black's Law Dictionary is a dictionary. It is used to look like it is used for the things dictionaries are used for. It is not a compendium of law.
I just, if they think the laws are made up anyway, why is the dictionary of the law real?
I I did see a great joke during my research. I apologize for stealing this, but I didn't remember to write down where it's from. Sovereign citizens think that dictionary editors from the early 20th century are an authoritative source. Real lawyers know it's judicial rulings from the 18th century that are a real authoritative source.
Oh my God. Okay. All right. One more to
There's
go.
one more, but
One more.
this is one of my favorites, but I do want to be, this is hard to say, fair to the sovereign citizens. Not everyone buys into this one, from what I can tell, but a surprising number are into something called truth language, which is a conspiracy promoted by a guy named David Windmiller. We're going to talk more about David Windmiller in a second, but right now I just want to talk about the belief of truth language. From the Anti-Defamation League, it is a complex and bizarre set of language rules designed to mimic the secret language of the law. All sentences must start with the preposition for, have a minimum of 13 words, and they must use more nouns than verbs. Those are just some of the rules. I don't know where he got that from. We're going to talk more about David Miller. I think he honestly was just a little bit like schizophrenic or something. But basically it's trying to create something that sounds lawyerish and is impenetrable. And because of that, you can interpret it to be whatever you want. For example, Miller believed that only nouns have a legal meaning, and hyphens in names make names a prepositional phrase, and therefore they are facts that cannot be debated. I found a ruling from a judge in Alberta, John Rook, that called this a bizarre form of legal grammar which is not merely incomprehensible in Canada, but equally so in any other jurisdiction. And just to shout out Rook real quickly, by the way, he is the author of a 2012 legal opinion that's very important in the history of the sovereign citizen movement, Meads versus Meads, which is originally a child welfare case where one guy claimed that because he was a child of God, the law did not bind him, and his wife took him to court over his child support. And Judge Rook, in his final decision, went through all of this guy's crazy sovereign citizen filings and just refuted them point by point, so that later judges could just refer to his decision and not have to rewrite everything. The man is a true legend. We're not going to get into that case any more than this, but yeah, it's Meads versus Meads. John Rook, true legend, doing it for the group. I do somewhere. Actually, no, we'll get in. We'll talk more about David Windmiller's weird language in a sec. But I just want to wrap this section up by saying that I did find an argument from Donald Nedlitsky, who wrote a work on the sovereign citizen worldview, describing what he called the sovereign citizen pseudo-law memeplex of 6 points that are kind of the center of their worldview. So this is kind of the summarized thing that you should think of as like the bullet points of common sovereign citizen beliefs. First, everything is a contract because the government is a corporation. Right? There are no laws, there are just contracts that are opt-in or opt-out. Second, silence means acceptance or agreement with a contract. Right? The refusal to be silent on the part of a sovereign citizen is their rejection of a contract, which in this case is the law. I also want to note, as a part of this, there are very limited cases where you can tacitly agree to something, but that's mostly not how contract law works. You have to actively agree to a contract. Third, the law can only act when there is an injured party, because all forms of law are commercial or civil and thus require some form of standing, right? Basically, the government can't hold you to account for anything unless it can prove it's being harmed by you. Which is not how criminal law works, but they don't believe criminal law is real. Everything is civil or commercial law. Fourth, as a result of this, state authority is defective or limited. Fifth is the whole straw man shtick. We're not going to go back into that. And sixth is weird financial conspiracy theories, both in terms of the globalist bankers and, basically overt or covert anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, or the whole money for nothing scheme. So, that's the sovereign citizen worldview. If your uncle starts spouting any of this off at Thanksgiving, that's the time to hit the oh shit button or get out the good bourbon. I don't judge, do what you have to do. Let's talk about some examples.
Oh my God. Okay.
Now
Hit
that
me
I've
with some
broken
examples
Demetrius'
of this,
brain.
this flawless legal logic. I'm sorry, man. I'm still absolutely reeling from this logic.
Oh, it's only going to get better. Because we're going to start with David Wynn Miller, or David-Win:*Miller, who was born in 1950 in Ohio, spent most of his life in Milwaukee, and was originally a welder and machinist, at least until the age of 25. Because, Demetria, do you know what happened when David Wynn Miller turned 25?
Hang on, I'm mentally calculating here. The mid 70s.
No, it has nothing to do with anything in the 70s. He died.
Oh no,
He just died. According to David Wynn
all
Miller.
right, end of story. Wow.
He claims
to that guy.
He claims that a surgeon removed both his kidneys and adrenal glands by accident during a surgery, and then he died, and then his heart restarted outside of his body during the autopsy, and he came back to life. And as a result, no, I'm not done. As a result, he developed an IQ of 200. He heightened all his endorphin levels, and he stopped aging.
I'm sorry. This guy just pulled himself up by his bootstraps out of death?
Yes. He walked it off.
Wow. Lucky for that surgeon that he chose to botch the surgery of the one guy who could just kind of willpower his way through it.
So obviously, David Win-Miller, David-Win:*Miller, having a real normal one at this point. And coincidentally, after his near-death experience, when he reaches an IQ of 200, he discovers what he calls quantum language. He claims he first figured this out in 1980, but he didn't start promoting it until 1988 when he could do it on the internet. But he believes it was a mathematical interface in the truth that certifies all 5,000 languages frontwards and backwards.
Oh boy. I should point out that mid-20s is a very common time for young men to have a psychotic break or manic episode or whatever's going on with him. This seems like a step beyond the usual divorced dad energy we were talking about earlier. There's something else going on here.
Yeah, I mean, do you think a guy that would produce this list of communication methods has anything going? Like, what could be going wrong with him?
This is a spectacular website. I say that a lot on this podcast, but oh boy, this is a 90s website.
Would you like to try and read the page I just sent you?
Is = singular verb, are = plural verb, ~2 / January / 2000 / now / time ~1 for the www.dwmlc.com of these facts are within these claims by these plenipotentiary / judges / correct / sentence / structure / communication / parse / syntax / grammar open parentheses C dot /
you don't have to keep doing this. It's okay. I just wanted to see how long you'd go before you give up, but I'm impressed.
You know what? Still easier to read than Finnegan's Wake.
That is true. This is at least more entertaining than Finnegan's Wake. I'm gonna be real with you guys.
Oh boy, this is not the writing of someone who is well.
Yeah. That's a list of David Wynn Miller's communication methods. His website is still up and you can go through them and we can put it in the show notes. Basically they are all rules intended to make language so obtuse that Miller can then interpret it however he wants. Using rules like, again, nouns are the only real part of language. Everything has to start with the preposition for, and just random interspersions of different punctuation.
I do want to point out that this guy has a whole section on his website where he's created a new constitution for Hawaiian sovereignty of the
Oh,
Hawaiian
no, that's
peoples.
because he turned Hawaii into a verb and then became the king of Hawaii in 1996.
What?
Yeah. Yeah, he rattles that off in every interview you see with him as just the most like nonchalant thing possible. That Hawaii is actually a verb, and that when he either discovered that or made it happen, I'm not totally clear which, he then became the king of Hawaii.
I was going to say it seemed unusually inclusive of him to respect the sovereignty of the Hawaiian peoples, but nope, just a deeper part of this craziness.
Hey, in his defense, he's not the first white guy to just decide that he's in charge of Hawaii now. Future
That's true.
episode,
He is.
perhaps. I also found an interview with him. I think the SPLC put this together. Yeah. Uh, Talking about the way he writes his name, David-Win Miller. Quote, the reason I use a full colon and a hyphen in my name, the first full colon, which is full colon David, it means for the David-Win. That's my given name, and it's also a noun because it uses a prepositional phrase. Because I use prepositional phrases through punctuation, which is classified as hieroglyphics, which makes me a life, Life. Now, when you don't punctuate your name, David is an adjective, Win is an adjective, Miller is a pronoun. Two adjectives are a condition of modification, opinion, presumption, which modifies the pronoun. Pro means no on noun, therefore I'm not a fact, I'm a fiction. If you do not do this, you are dead.
So, this is pretty obviously bonkers, and this does not
Oh,
seem
no,
like a
I'm not done
guy.
yet.
Oh,
He
you.
also believes that
Oh my
maritime
god.
law applies around the world because the Earth is a vessel in the sea of space. It's all spaceship Earth, baby. And that the whole world is controlled by the U.S. Post Office, which also blew up the Twin Towers using C4, which he determined using quantum grammar because, quote, direct quote, all steel is plastic.
You know what? I have another apology. I am sorry, postal inspectors. I have not been kind to you on this show, but
They control the whole world.
apparently all that C4 that you don't let us send through the mail has been going somewhere.
Well, you know, the post office thing is actually also a surprisingly common one. The belief that the post office is like central to this strange conspiracy theory behind the US government. I didn't really unpack it that much, but like, I just want to take this moment to say support your local postal employees. Thanks, post office. You do great work for not that much money.
There's a whole postal treaty where he appears to be doing something involving the cancellation of stamps.
I I assume stamps are a contract or something. Everything's a contract. Don't worry about it. Basically, David Miller, he probably had some not great things going on in his brain, but he was well enough to make a shitload of money hawking seminars on how quantum language works. And
Yes, now we get to the scam. Okay, now we're back in territory that I'm familiar with.
he claimed to be able to certify people in this language, which of course would be like the secret cheat code that could, let you beat any legal case, which he knew because he was a judge. He claimed that he was a plenipotentiary judge, which has no basis in anything. I did do some looking, not much. From what I could find, every ruling referencing him or his ideas was dismissed before trial, which I'm not shocked by. But he was able to get people to pay him a lot of money to give seminars in this kind of secret language code, at least until 2017, when the immortal David Wynn, who did not age, had a heart attack, had some health complications from it, and then he died the next year. I do want to note also, if you look
Okay.
at photos of him as he gets older, he is visibly aging, but he's caking on more and more makeup to try and look like he's not, to maintain the whole fiction, and it's very grim.
Okay. So he floated around for a while in that sort of 2000s new agey culture, giving his weird language seminars. And how on earth did this guy actually influence a movement?
I don't know that. I mean, people went to his seminars. The quantum language thing did spread around. It's not a part of the next movement we're going to talk about, though.
Oh boy. Okay. Uh-oh.
Look,
How
this
much
is
should
all.
I brace myself for this?
Look, we've been too concerned with worldly matters here. I think let's find our inner peace through religion, because it turns out actually that we don't need to worry about laws or citizenship or all of that, because the only real law, Demetria, is the law of the kingdom of heaven, which is a literal, real place that you can become a citizen of through the embassy of heaven.
Oh, that's convenient. I thought I was too busy sinning to get into heaven, but I'm really glad I could just, take a flight over there.
Realistically, you probably are, but apparently you can also mail heaven a check and get some license plates. So, if you haven't heard of the Embassy of Heaven, they are a sovereign citizen group. They're also local. They're based in Oregon. And they believe that the kingdom of heaven, referenced in Christian theology, is not an abstract notion of a better world to come or present. I don't really know that much about Christianity. I'm gonna be real. But actually, it's a literal physical kingdom that they are citizens of. And I want to note, they call themselves citizens of the kingdom. My understanding is that usually you are a subject of a kingdom, because a kingdom inherently does not have equal rights. Yes, you found the website, I see.
Isaac, yes, I found another very 90s website.
GeoCities ass website. It's
Honestly,
amazing.
By the standards of Oregon cults, this one doesn't even stand out that much.
Well, it was founded, I think, by a guy who used to be a used to be a systems analyst for the Oregon state government. Maybe that means he has a background in web design.
This homepage does have a step-by-step guide for going to jail linked very prominently, which makes me think this may be something that the citizens of the Kingdom of Heaven deal with quite frequently.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. But that's okay, because they are in opposition to the power of the state, and going to jail just proves that they are willing to stand against the state, which is actually run by wizards.
Oh, okay. A different group of men in hats, huh?
Oh, I don't think they're talking about literal magic wizards. It appears to be a reference to the Wizard of Oz, like they're just a bunch of guys behind the curtain who look intimidating but really aren't. I don't think they mean the government is actually run by, real magic wizards, but I could be wrong. I didn't want to spend too much time on this website. I was a little worried I was going to get a computer virus.
There is some spectacular MS Paint art on this website. I don't know what to tell you, man.
So a lot of their theology also revolves around the idea that the U.S. government is inherently pagan and anti-Christian. A lot of that seems to be pointing to neoclassical imagery in Washington, D.C. and being see, that's not Washington being shown with a bunch of Greco-Roman gods. That's not Jesus. I don't know, man.
Okay, so I'm assuming that there's some... Oh my god, my brain is just completely broken from talking about
just
people.
wait,
okay.
just wait. Okay, so the group is based in Staten, Oregon, but they do have a presence in Washington, shockingly in Eastern Washington, and in Minnesota, led by a guy named Craig Douglas Fleshman, who was originally, he worked for the Oregon state government, but then founded this church in 1987 that then turned into the Embassy of Heaven. But if you call him that today, he won't answer to that. That's his government name. Today, he only answers to the name Pastor Paul Revere.
I don't even know where to go. I can't even make a joke. This is so fucking banana pants.
Pastor Paul Revere, do you know what inspired him to actually do his own research and discover that the laws aren't real and only the kingdom of heaven is real?
Well, based on the amount of ranting about marriage and divorce on this website and the marital humor page, I'm assuming it was a really rough divorce.
Actually, a traffic ticket in this case. I think the rough divorce came later.
Okay, all right. So that's not really his villain origin story. That's more his
that's
his spiral
the
out
second
of control.
arc.
Okay.
No, apparently he got a traffic ticket in 1985, tried to fight it, and as a result did his research, and came to the conclusion that Oregon's constitution had been amended in such a way in 1910 that it gave the legislature control of the court system, by virtue of the legislature being empowered to create courts other than the Supreme Court. And therefore the legislature had usurped the judicial power. I just want to point out for everyone listening, that's just how courts work. All courts work this way, where the legislature creates the number of courts it feels are necessary and funds them because they control the budget. That's how the US Constitution works. That's how they all work. But
isn't the independence of the legislature from the courts kind of like the point? Like, I mean, we kind of had a few civics lessons about checks and balances.
He's convinced that courts are not legitimate because they're controlled by the legislature and thus undermine the separation of powers. And that's ridiculous because the Bible is clear that the servant shouldn't be greater than the master. The legislature has become too powerful, and so we have to abandon the U.S. government and return to real principles founded on both common law and the Bible, which in his eyes appear to be basically the same thing.
Okay. Okay, so are you done with this guy, or is there more crazy shit?
No, there's so much more. I would like you to read some text I pulled from his website. This is a primer to his beliefs. It starts with an exercise asking you to pull your wallet out, okay? So just imagine you've pulled your wallet out, and can you read this in your best, like, Bible-thumping pastor voice, please?
Let's see. Here's a social security card. Where did that come from? Did it come from Jesus Christ, who is an ever-present help in times of trouble? No. It is a protection plan put out by the kingdoms of the world. Oh, and it is also a number so that the world system can keep track of you. The next item in your wallet is a state driver license. You have obviously volunteered to have the world system regulate your traveling. Here are a couple of credit cards. You are apparently part of a banking system, and you've been given the privilege of buying things before you have the funds to pay for them. So these cards are what you depend on to take care of you in emergencies. But wait a minute, what about Jesus? I didn't see anything of his. When does Jesus Christ show up in all this? It looks like you've done a fine job of becoming enslaved to men. Who owns you anyway? The real issue boils down to this. You are either marked by the beast or you are marked by Jesus Christ.
There you go. That's pretty much the theology that basically contracting with the government in any way is, in a sovereign citizen way, accepting the rule of the kingdoms of earth, and you have to reject that and return to the original law, which is kind of common law, but also like the law of the Bible, in his words.
So he's just against living in a society as a concept?
Yes, he does not want to live in a society. Or I guess he just wants to live in a society only full of true believers who don't have to pay taxes or have driver's licenses.
So what happens to this guy? Because he seems pretty determined to live separate from the world, including, I assume, his wife who got fed up with this shit.
He spends a lot of time in jail. He was arrested for the first time in 1994 for driving without a license, and got into a bunch of trouble having his property seized in 1997 for owing $10,000 in back taxes. He also got dinged by Minnesota in 2012 for selling fraudulent auto insurance. He'd been selling something he claimed was mutual insurance, or mutual assurance, excuse me, not insurance, through the kingdom of God. And then someone tried to use it after getting in an accident, and it turned into a whole legal case. And his response was, if they want to regulate assurance, they have to regulate God. We don't operate in Minnesota. We operate in the kingdom of heaven.
Wait, he was basically selling indulgences as insurance?
From what I can tell, yeah.
Wow, kicking it old school, dude.
It's amazing the number of weird Protestants in America. I don't know if this is true everywhere, but definitely in America, who would probably call Catholics like pagans and idol worshippers, but then just recreate the history of Catholic theology. Like, I mean, this is a great example of indulgences, but it's for car accidents. Yeah, it's...
I did also see for a website I presume by someone who considers himself a Protestant, this guy really loves Tolstoy for some reason.
Yeah, I don't know. I assume he had a very memorable college class at some point. Anyway,
Wow.
that's the
Okay.
Embassy of Heaven. Many of their followers have been arrested in Oregon and Washington for driving around in their license, using those license plates. But we have an even weirder one actually coming up, which is the
Oh my
Moorish
God.
sovereign citizen movement.
Oh boy. Okay. I remember in last week's episode, you mentioned that there are black sovereign citizen movements, which is a bit strange
That
considering
it originally
how
is a neo-Nazi movement, yeah.
insanely racist this started off as.
So
So how do we get here?
let's talk about it. First, we have to talk a bit about who the Moors are, and the Moorish Science Temple of America. This is a new religion, we might call it, associated with Timothy Drew, also known as the Noble Drew Ali, born sometime in 1886 in North Carolina. Really interesting story where this guy basically becomes a religious prophet, claiming to be a reincarnation of great prophets, given lost sections of the Quran, which are actually, from what I can tell, are a hodgepodge of older New Age texts. But his claim is that African Americans are descendants of the Moabites of the Bible and are thus Moorish by ethnicity and Muslim by religion. There's an interesting sort of interplay here where, like, the Nation of Islam is eventually going to branch off of the Moorish Science Temple. It's going to, splinter into a bunch of movements after Drew Ali dies. And not all of them are sovereign citizen movements, but some of them are. They're not directly. The Moorish sovereign citizens are generally not directly affiliated with the Moorish Science Temple, the main religion descended from Drew Ali and his teachings. They first appeared to have started showing up in the 90s, right around the time that the Posse Comitatus, their ideas start to like morph into the internet and spread around the world. The oldest Moorish group I could find is called the Washita Nation, which is from Louisiana. They are associated with the self-proclaimed Empress Viridiachi Tiara Watisha Turner Gostin El Bey, who was born in 1927. She later claimed that she was born in her placenta. I kicked it out on my own and it rolled up on my head like a crown. Uh,
Oh girl, okay.
and then after that, she became a civil rights activist for much of her life. She was the mayor of Richwood, Louisiana for 2 terms. But then appears to have gotten hit by a federal indictment for embezzling government money in 1984, and went a little kooky. As a result, falls off the map for a bit and then returns in 1993 with a book called Return of the Ancient Ones. You can find the whole book online on Scribd. You can read it if you want. I'm not going to. I value my time. But her claim is that Black Americans are the long-lost descendants of the Mound Builder civilization, this indigenous group that basically disappeared around the time that the Spanish introduced a bunch of diseases to the Americas.
This, okay, yes. We were actually just talking about this civilization because I grew up in a time and a place where I was told by some teachers that the mound builders died because they ate too much corn.
Yeah, I
Because
got that one too
they weren't
in a
quite,
high school.
yeah, they weren't quite ready for that conversation about smallpox
Yeah,
yet.
actually, they all died probably because of smallpox. But she claims that the mound builders, the Washita Nation, then are the descendants of, or the Black Americans are their descendants. In reality, the Wachita/Washita were later assimilated into a tribe that's now residing in Oklahoma. She also claims that the Louisiana Purchase only applied to New Orleans proper. This is when America bought the Louisiana Territory from France. And that the rest of Louisiana, I am unclear if she means the state or the whole Louisiana Territory, is the property of the Washita Nation. That they, and really she as their empress, own that land. She also claims that Louisiana State, the World Bank, and the IMF all recognize her. Of course, none of that's documented. But she starts selling birth certificates, passports, motorist certificates, and motorized conveyance registrations that basically, like, it's a scam, right? You can pay her money and she'll mark you as a citizen of the Washita Nation, and then within the territory of the nation, no law applies to you.
Honestly, I feel way more comfortable with this variety of out and out scamming than whatever the fuck the other guys were doing.
Yeah, this just seems like she honestly wanted to make a little bit of extra money.
This seems like maybe preying on a group of people who do have a pretty tragic history of why they are in this country and would perhaps like to hear a version of that history where they have a lot more agency and actually can reclaim some of what they've lost. So I understand why that's a very tempting narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, honestly, that really bothers me about this is that it's basically trying to prey on people by selling them a line based on what they want to hear, which I guess is really what all scams are at a fundamental level. I do want to note that members of the Washita Nation also became infamous for a tactic associated with some sovereign citizen movements like the Montana Freemen, using fake property liens to target people they don't like. So one of the members of the movement got 2 years in Missouri because a judge refused to junk her speeding ticket, so she filed a bunch of fake liens against that judge's property. As for the Empress herself, her compound was raided by the FBI in 2000 for failure to pay taxes. That never went to trial, from what I can tell. That just the IRS decided there wasn't enough at stake to make it worthwhile. But the kind of legal troubles around the Empress continue until her death in 2014. The group is still around, but it's not as popular without her. She was really kind of the front of the whole thing. There's other sovereign Moor groups. The biggest one is probably the Nuwaubians. Speaking of the shittily opportunistic people, Dwight York is the founder of the Nuwaubian movement, born in New York in 1945. And just a really shitty guy. His first time he shows up in government records is a conviction for child sexual assault in the 60s.
Whoop, there we go. I was wondering when that was
Yep.
coming with the sovereign citizens.
So eventually he starts moving into conning people through religion instead of more traditional cons, and founds a Morris offshoot group in the 70s that goes through a few different names. Originally, it's the Ansaru Allah community. And basically the way this works, he fundraises from his believers. They buy a bunch of property and set up their own kind of like independent area. So the AAC will own like apartment buildings. All the members have to reside there. They then have to go out and hit a quota for either begging money or selling like pamphlets to people. Usually that quota is between $25 and $100 a day in the 70s and 80s. So like a decent chunk of money. And meanwhile, York kind of serves as the spiritual leader of a movement with a very amorphous belief system. I'm going to quote directly from the SPLC report on these guys. It is difficult to describe the Nuwaubians' belief system because it has changed over time and lacks internal consistency. The group has put out dozens of books, many of which were largely plagiarized from New Age works. As a result, Nuwaubian mythology is a disorienting mix of UFO theories, talk about the significance of Egypt and the pyramids, reference to Atlantis, retellings of stories from the Bible and other religious texts. A common claim is that the original humans were blacks, and that blacks are genetically superior to other races. White people are called devils, a concept derived from the Nation of Islam. But Nuwaubians allege their lighter skin color is a result of leprosy and the fact that their ancestors mated with dogs and jackals. Yeah.
Okay, so some very questionable outlet for some understandable frustration, I'm guessing, around this time period. But yeah, this guy is just an flat out MLM style scammer.
Yeah, and you can really see it in the belief system too. In the 90s, he'll drop any pretension of connection to Islam. He'll briefly try and claim that his tribe is his group is a long lost Native American tribe. He briefly calls himself Chief Black Eagle of the Yamasee Native American Moors of the Creek Nation, and applies for a casino license as a part of this. But that doesn't really work out. And they settle on Nuwaubians, and from what I can tell, he basically watched Stargate and kind of liked that like Egyptian gods and space vibe and built a whole religion around it.
Wow, okay. So has there been any record of how much this guy actually believes what he's selling versus how
yes,
much
actually.
is just full-on junk?
So his son, one of his sons, Jacob, left this group in 1990 and later confronted his dad about the both the financial scheming he was doing. He made himself very rich and built a little cult community in Georgia called Tamaray, and also accusations of really fucked up assault of women, including minors. And when confronted, this was York's response: "I don't believe in any of this shit. If I had to dress up like a nun, if I had to be a Jew, I'd do it for this type of money."
Oh boy. All right, buddy.
But actually, the reason that he comes up for us is that Nubians will now defend themselves with a lot of sovereign citizen language, because they actually were connected to the Montana Freemen. You might remember the
I
Freemen.
remember the Montana
Yeah.
Freeman.
Back before they got raided in the 90s by the feds, the Freemen made a lot of money by going on like talking circuits explaining their ideology. And a bunch of them apparently came to Putnam County in Georgia, where the Nubian headquarters was, and basically spread their ideology, kind of be like, oh, you can be a common law judge, and then the law doesn't apply to you, and you can build your pyramid to contact Ra or whatever. When the Nubians eventually get shut down, York in particular is in prison since 2002 for so many crimes. Then that ideology spreads out of Nubianism. A lot of Nubians will leave, but they'll take this to other Moorish groups that have kind of like exploded out of the Nubian movement. That movement's still around, but it only has a few thousand members today. And yeah, that's the Moorish sovereign citizen movement. There's one other weird offshoot of it that, God, we've been going for over an hour. Basically, some of these guys also claim that the U.S.-Morocco Treaty of 1787 makes them immune to all law. I have no idea why that would be the case. That's a trade treaty that we signed with Morocco, one of the first ones we ever signed, which is pretty cool. We have a long history of good relations with Morocco in this country. But it doesn't say anything about people have Moorish citizenship not having the law apply to them. Article 21 of that treaty literally says the law of the country shall apply if a citizen from one party commits a crime in the territory of another. Like, just
Wow.
read it,
Okay.
guy. Get off YouTube. Just read it. It's not that hard.
So, okay, you bring up YouTube, and this leads me to what I was going to ask, which is you've just showed me 3 different complete fruitcakes. Let's call it 2 fruitcakes and
A con artist.
and then a couple folks who kind of knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
How does this level of batshittery get to the internet in a way that is actually like people talk about sovereign citizens like they are an actual problem that needs to be addressed? This seems very fringe, very, very fringe. So fringe that I can't even imagine like a YouTube video by any of these guys doing numbers. How is this information spreading? How is this becoming an actual persistent problem?
I mean, that's the thing. I think, like, it's something that you wouldn't see on the internet unless you go looking for it. But once you start looking for specific keywords, there is a lot out there. I mean, if you look on YouTube, that platform has cracked down on some of its sovereign citizen stuff. That's pretty recent. They used to be pretty open in allowing that sort of content on their service. Same with Facebook, which did have some pretty active sovereign citizen groups. And before that, just, forums in the 2000s that were very lightly moderated. I think people forget in this age of Web 2.0 that, there's a lot of nostalgia for the old internet in some circles, and particularly among people our age, I think, when the internet was less about being sold shit through ads. But part of what came with that was that you would have these spaces that were functionally impossible to moderate because of the number of people involved in them and the number of people willing to do that work that let this stuff spread in really messed up ways. It is true, I think, that the people who are most susceptible to this tend to have something else going on. Usually something that makes them already kind of want a way out of the system they're in. There's so much language that you see in a lot of these movements about, like, we'll get you out of tickets, we'll get you out of unpaid debts, we'll get you out of child support. We will get you out of criminal convictions that are maybe holding you back from finding a job. Um, and if you're that desperate, like if you're in that position and you're having a hard time, I can see how the easy thing appeals to you.
So this is making me remember a very, very good documentary, not about sovereign citizens, but about flat earthers, called Behind the Curve, that follows some people who are involved in the movement and digs into the fascinating personal problems that have caused them to become isolated in such a way that this movement becomes their social group. Is this something that is happening to these sovereign citizens? What seems to be leading people towards these movements seems to be a level of personal tragedy or disaffectedness with society, or going through a difficult time in their lives, where these movements give them someone to blame, and I presume give them a community of other people, even if only online, to commiserate with. Is that what is going on with some of
I
these?
think that's very true for a lot of these. That like this becomes kind of the social circle that you hold on to. Um, and you can see it pretty clearly in some of the instances, I think, of people who have gotten into trouble with the law because they were part of the sovereign citizen movement. In 2021, there was a big armed standoff in Massachusetts between the police and a Moorish militia group that got up. Basically, their cars were in the breakdown lane. The cops came to look, and they had a bunch of rifles with no paperwork for them. That resulted in this online standoff where the Moors would be like streaming it back to their other adherents. Like they were taking videos and putting them up and live streaming what was happening. This becomes kind of like, that's how they're connected, is through the internet. That forms these kind of social bonds. I think it's also worth noting that a lot of these conspiracy mindsets are very permeable. Let's put it that way. There were a good number of sovereign citizens who participated in the January 6th insurrection. The most notable is a guy named Taylor James Jonatakis, who is convicted for assaulting police officers during the insurrection, and was actually tried by a U.S. judge named Royce Lamberth, who I've met. He's actually a relative of one of my colleagues. Very nice guy. Very interesting dude, hearing his thoughts on law and the judicial system in the modern U.S. But guys like Jonatakis are, I think, a great example of how buying into, once you get into the conspiracy theory worldview, it's easy to get further and further down the rabbit hole. There's always more theories you can tack onto the belief system, where you can start in like flat earth and then end up veering into the sovereign citizens, because who's kind of hiding the truth of the earth from you? Oh, well, it's the American the government, because they're enthralled to this evil corporation. And then from there, it's pretty easy to end up in QAnonville, right? And end up in like the January 6th kind of the insurrection movement. It's not that these are all kind of strongly delineated different groups. They're kind of fuzzy groups that overlap with each other in a kind of segment of similar worldviews that enables the transfer of ideas across them, which is why I think it makes sense to look at them as a whole movement rather than focusing specifically on, the Embassy of Heaven versus the Washita Nation and so on.
I'm trying to sort of find anything coherent to say about this movement.
I
It's so incoherent as a movement that it's hard to sum it up neatly with a bow here.
I mean, I have some thoughts. Um,
All right, hit me with them. I am just completely I'm still fucking thinking about this Kingdom of Heaven guy.
you know,
I've got his website open. This man loves his MS Paint art. He hates margarine, really hates margarine.
that's a weird one. Haven't heard that one before.
I think a lot of his friends seem to have had heart problems.
Oh, so I mean, here's the thing. We've had some good times on this show talking about how cuckoo banana pants these people are, and there's a good reason they're crazy. I feel a bit bad putting it that bluntly, because a lot of them very clearly are in crisis, or like were driven to this by a bad turn. But ultimately, I'm also like of the position that you are responsible for the choices you make, even in bad circumstances. and choosing to go into what I think you have to call extremism, that's still a choice that you are making. And, these people aren't just, great sources of comedy for a medium tier podcast. They're dangerous. Quite a few sovereign citizens have been involved in shootouts with the police. A Washington based one tried to kidnap Governor Gary Locke in 2003. And, again, uh, there were members in the January 6th insurrection. And even when they're non-violent, they cause pretty serious financial crimes. Those false liens can really fuck someone's life up. And their tendency to just put up like piles of bogus court filings helps to, back up our court system and make it unusable for the things it's actually for. Like, that does hurt people when you just throw stuff into the system just because. So I really, I suspect personally that a lot of what's going on here is kind of main character syndrome, like wanting to believe that anything bad in your life is like you specifically are being targeted, and you can find this like heroic way to turn that around and kind of free yourself. And that, it's very important to kind of immunize yourself from that worldview and really just accept that, like, we live in a complicated shared society where sometimes shit does not come down your way, and that's sad, and we should find ways to make that more fair. But that doesn't mean you kind of just get to be like, well, fuck you, the laws don't apply to me anymore. I don't know, I find that attitude very frustrating.
That is a very mature attitude of you to have. It is hard to dissuade people from a worldview that seems to blame everybody else for all of their problems.
I mean, I do, and this is going to sound mean, and I mean it. I think one of the things that really frightens me about this whole shtick is that it is reminiscent, in my view, of the kind of worldview that someone enters into kind of the fascist ecosystem with, where it is not really, it's based on like wanting to believe a certain thing, and really like this idea of wanting to feel a certain way about yourself and the world, and then constructing a worldview around it that justifies you doing whatever you want to get the things that you want. And I think that mindset is really dangerous. And combating it wherever possible is a good thing, both because we live in a society, and you have to kind of accept that not everything is about you because of that. And also because call me crazy, but I think a lot of these people could pretty easily be pushed over into joining fascist movements without that much work, considering that they fell for a worldview that is grounded pretty strongly in that, even if the explicit association is not there for all of them.
Yeah, this seems like, I mean, some of them seem like they've already arrived in some pretty nasty places, but this seems like a pipeline into some potential real nastiness.
And I just want to close by also reminding everyone that yelling fancy words in that sound vaguely lawyerish is not magic. That's not how the law works. Yes, it's written in weird and complicated ways, but yelling Latin does not allow you to just short circuit like everything. And
I cast Fireball.
You can't solve every problem in D&D with Fireball, Demetria.
I cast Fireball. Problem solved.
All right. Well, on that note, if any of you listening would like to direct Demetria to other parts of the spell list in Dungeons & Dragons, where can they find us?
You can find us on our website, facingbackward.com.
You can also support our work at patreon.com/facingbackward. If you want to enable me to buy a bunch of books on the history of terrorism by right-wing groups in the US and ruin my Amazon recommendation algorithm completely in the process.
And special shout-outs to our patrons who pledged at the shout-out tier. You are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuda, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonasia podcast, Jennifer Pianzo, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation, which is a legitimate government, attacked.
Until next time, folks, remember to just put colons and hyphens between every word and everything you write, and you'll unlock the mystic truth of language. Or some shit. I don't know.